Hello again. I'm back. I'm by the roadside, so you will be hearing cars and possibly an occasional train. So yes, I'm covering Defense of Ethical Objectivism by Louis Pojman, and how this is understood in relation to cultural relativism. So this is really important to start getting the groundwork for how this is working and how we're understanding both ethical objectivism and likewise ethical relativism, okay? And so right off the top we have ethical relativism as it's understood by John Ladd, as Pojman quotes him. And so Pojman divides John Ladd's argument into three parts on page 39. So in the subchapter An Analysis on Relativism, we have John Ladd's argument divided into three. So the first two parts are the premises, and the third part is then the conclusion. And so that's taking us to understand what is an argument in philosophy. Basically, premises are reasoning in support of a conclusion. So that's how we could just basically think of an argument. And this is John Ladd's argument in favor of ethical relativism. And this is something that Pojman is going to argue against, and likewise what we are going to argue against, because we, like Pojman, are in favor of ethical objectivity, okay? So yes, and the first two parts are, like I said, are the premises. And so the first part is what Pojman refers to as the diversity thesis, and that is, quote, moral rightness and wrongness of actions vary from society to society, so there are no universal moral standards held by all societies. And that is the diversity thesis. So in other words, there's a diversity amongst cultures and societies, and so the premise to the conclusion, and the conclusion once again is, therefore there is no absolute or objective moral standards that apply to all people everywhere. So that first diversity thesis is reasoning that's giving us the conclusion, right? And there is that idea that there is the diversity of cultures, and that because there's that diversity, there is not an agreed upon moral standard, okay? And so what we're going to do is call that into question, okay? By way of moral objectivity, right? So moral objectivity is the proposal that there are objective standards by which we're working morally, and those are in contrast to ethical subjectivity, ethical conventionalism, cultural relativism, okay? And so that's the diversity thesis. So the second part is whether or not it is right for individuals to act in a certain way depends on or is relative to the society to which they belong. So that's the dependency thesis, and that's depending on the society in which you are. That's where your morality is going to reside, is in depending on the society or the position that you start from, okay? So it has an individual emphasis, and likewise it has a cultural / societal emphasis. So that is the dependency thesis. In other words, it depends on where you come from, depends on your point of view, or likewise it depends on the culture that you're from, or it depends on your point of view. But there's no objective standard that stands above and beyond that. So in other words, it's a relativist position, it's a relativist premise, it's relativist reasoning that's getting us to say that it depends on your position, it depends on your position, your society. That's the dependency thesis in favor of the reasoning that's getting us to the argument of relativism, right? So that's a great way to get us just familiar with the argument, and then also you're getting a feeling for what is objectivity, right? So objectivity is in contrast to this. Objectivity / moral objectivity is in contrast to this because it's giving us this idea that there are moral standards in spite of the differences of individuals, and also in spite of the differences of culture and society, okay? So moral objectivity is that idea that there are universal standards by which we understand morality, and that's the argument that we're going to favor, okay? So in other words, we're in contrast to, along with pojman, in favor of objectivity, okay? So, for instance, when you take the dependency thesis, okay, so the second premise, whether or not it is right for individuals to act in a certain way, depends on the society to which they belong. If we just take that to, say, pollution, okay? So in other words, if I decide to pollute as an individual, my right to do that depends on the culture from which I come from, or the society from which I come from, okay? That's the premise. And it's interesting because once you see that as a premise, you could see that right away as questionable, right? Because we could see, well, maybe there is an objective standard that stands in contrast to that line of reasoning in terms of there being a universal principle by which we're going to say, well, no, it doesn't just depend on the individual, or likewise, it doesn't just depend on your culture. Pollution and polluting seems to be a bad thing overall, not depending on the culture that you're from, but rather in contrast to individual position. In other words, there's a universal standard that stands as a way that we're thinking that pollution is bad, okay? And therefore it is an objective way that we're understanding our moral position, okay? So if we then take a similar tactic with the diversity thesis, so going to the first premise of Ladd's argument, moral rightness and wrongness of actions vary from society to society, so there are no universal moral standards held by all societies. That is the diversity thesis. This is one that we're used to hearing, that we're all different, so therefore that difference justifies there not being an objective standard. In other words, the line of reasoning is a premise that's in favor of the conclusion, therefore there are no absolute or objective moral standards that apply to all people everywhere. That premise is in support of that relativist position. So in other words, the diversity / difference is such that there is not an objective standard that governs between the two, or that holds between the two positions. So in other words, I have a view of pollution and you have a view of pollution, but there's not an objective standard of pollution that holds between the two of us enough that justifies the different ethical positions. So in other words, I could have my ethical position on pollution, you could have your ethical position on pollution, and because you and I are different, or you and I are of diverse opinion, that there is not an objective standard that holds between the two of us to regulate the behavior enough to say that one is right or wrong above and beyond our differences, okay? So that's giving us a sense of how it is that we're understanding objectivity, moral objectivity. So in other words, something that pojman is in defense of. And likewise, it's getting us to a position of how it is that we're looking at ethical relativism, conventionalism, cultural relativism, and likewise subjectivism, okay? So subjectivism there is in contrast to objectivism. So subjectivism is this idea that my personal view, so that goes in line with the diversity thesis, I'm different from you in my personal view, and my personal view is that it's all right to litter, and so therefore I do, because there's not an objective standard that holds me to your ethical standard. So because we have diversity of opinion, we can't justify an objective moral standard that holds between us, okay? So that is probably a good way to start getting us familiar with some of the basic ways in which pojman is thinking and guiding us. Because remember, his position was at the end that there are objective standards. So in other words, we shouldn't torture people just for the fun of it. And likewise, we could come up with our own objective standards too that we could recognize as far as climate change and problems of pollution. In other words, it seems that there's a objective way in which we understand pollution that stands in contrast to a relativist position, likewise a conventionalist position, or a position that's justifying a subjective view that's just because there's a difference of opinion that shouldn't that should then allow us to do as we will with the planet, right? So think about those things and take it from there. Thank you. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.